The small cafe on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, had the kind of warmth that made people linger. The scent of fresh brewed coffee mixed with the subtle sweetness of homemade pastries, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. It was the kind of place where nobody expected to see the Vice President of the United States walk through the door. But tonight, JD Vance did just that. Wearing a simple dark coat and jeans, he stepped inside, shaking off the cold March wind. His presence was unannounced, unplanned, a rare moment away from the polished speeches and staged events of Washington. He just wanted a cup of coffee, a moment to breathe. But as he moved toward the counter, something stopped him in his tracks. In the back corner of the cafe, sitting alone at a small wooden table, was a man. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped tightly around a ceramic mug, his breathing uneven. And then, JD saw the tears. The man, gray-haired, weary, wearing an old military jacket, was crying, quietly but visibly. The cafe's usual energy seemed to shift. Some people had noticed. A few glanced his way, but nobody approached. Nobody knew what to say. JD did. Without hesitation, he walked past the counter, past the murmuring customers, and straight toward the man's table. The veteran did not look up at first. He was lost in something. Some memory, some pain that had resurfaced in this small cafe on an otherwise ordinary night. JD gently pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. No cameras, no microphones, just two men at a table. The veteran slowly lifted his gaze, his tired eyes meeting JD's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then JD asked, a single question that changed everything. "Sir, what happened?" The entire cafe fell silent, and in that moment no one knew what would happen next. The cafe had gone completely silent. Conversations had faded. The hum of espresso machines now felt distant, as if the world had narrowed down to just two men at a wooden table. JD Vance sat across from the veteran, his gaze steady, patient. "Sir, what happened?" The older man exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edges of his coffee mug. He did not answer right away. His fingers trembled slightly, and for the first time, JD noticed the scar on his wrist, the deep lines across his knuckles, marks of time, of battles fought long ago, of wounds both seen and unseen. The veteran let out a small, bitter chuckle. "You are the Vice President of the United States," he finally said, his voice rough, worn. "And you are sitting at my table asking me what happened?" JD nodded. He did not flinch, he did not deflect, he just waited. The man sighed, rubbing his temples, as if debating whether to say the words that had been sitting on his chest for too long. And then he spoke. "I came here to be alone," the veteran admitted. "But the problem is, I have been alone for too damn long." A lump formed in JD's throat, but he did not interrupt. "I served in Iraq," the man continued, his voice quiet now. "Lost some good men out there. Came home to a country that moved on without us. People shake our hands, say, 'Thank you for your service,' and then go back to their lattes like we were never there." JD felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. The man shook his head, staring into his coffee as if it held memories instead of reflections. "My wife passed last year," he said, his voice faltering. "Heart attack. Just gone." JD noticed how tightly the man gripped his mug, as if holding on to it kept him from falling apart completely. "She was the only person who ever really understood me," the veteran whispered. "And now, I wake up every morning wondering why the hell I am still here." The cafe remained deathly still. A barista behind the counter wiped at her eyes discreetly. JD leaned forward slightly. His voice was soft but firm. "You are still here," he said, "because your story is not over." The veteran looked up sharply, his tired eyes filled with something unreadable. And in that moment, the entire cafe was waiting for what JD Vance would say next. The veteran's eyes narrowed, his grief momentarily giving way to something else. Skepticism, maybe even anger. "Not over," he repeated, his voice low, rough. "You think I have not heard that before? People love to say things like that. Stay strong, keep going. But they do not know what it is like." JD did not look away. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I know what it is like to wake up and wonder if you belong in the world anymore." The veteran's brow furrowed. JD exhaled, his fingers lacing together on the table. "My mother struggled with addiction," he said. "There were days when I did not know if she would make it through the night. There were nights when I did not know if I would." The veteran's posture shifted slightly. The hardened resistance in his face flickered. Just for a second. "I know what it is like to feel like the world has moved on without you," JD continued, "to feel like your pain is invisible. But here is the thing. Your life is not invisible. I see you. I hear you. And I am not going to pretend that your pain is something that can be solved with a few nice words over coffee." The veteran swallowed hard. JD leaned in, his voice steady. "But I am going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." The man's fingers tightened around his mug. "What is her name?" JD asked softly. The veteran froze. He blinked, caught off guard. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. "Your wife," JD said. "The woman who understood you. The woman you loved." For a moment, the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. The veteran let out a long, unsteady exhale. His lips trembled just slightly before he spoke. "Margaret?" he whispered. "Her name was Margaret." JD nodded, a small, knowing smile appearing at the corners of his mouth. "Tell me about her," he said. The veteran's hands loosened their grip on the mug. The deep lines on his face, the ones carved by years of war and loss, softened. And for the first time that night, he did not look like a man trapped in his past. He looked like a man who wanted to remember. And as he began to speak, the entire cafe, the baristas, the customers, the strangers who had been eavesdropping but could not look away, sat in absolute silence. Because this was no longer just a conversation. This was a moment of healing. The veteran took a shaky breath, staring at his coffee as if it held pieces of the past. "Margaret," he said again, softer this time, almost like a prayer. She had the brightest laugh, the kind that made people turn their heads in a room. She loved old jazz records, used to dance in the kitchen when she thought I was not looking. A small, tired chuckle escaped his lips, but there was something else in his voice now. Something beyond pain. It was love. JD did not interrupt. He let the man speak, let the memories surface, let the silence between them be filled with something other than grief. "She waited for me," the veteran continued, his voice breaking slightly, "through 2 deployments. She sent me letters. Every single week I still have them." He wiped at his face, embarrassed by the tears that had begun to fall. "She was my world," he whispered. JD let the words settle before speaking. "And she still is," he said. The veteran looked up sharply, his eyes wet and questioning. "She is not gone," JD continued. "Not really. Love like that does not just disappear. It does not stop existing because the person is no longer here." The veteran's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. JD leaned forward slightly. "Do you still hear her laugh?" he asked. The older man froze. His lips parted slightly, as if he had never considered it before. "Do you still remember the way she danced?" JD pressed. "The way she said your name? The way she held your hand?" The veteran's breathing hitched, because he did remember. He remembered all of it. "Then she is not gone," JD said, his voice gentle but firm. "She is right here in everything you remember, in everything you carry forward." A tear slipped down the veteran's cheek. The cafe remained completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the employees behind the counter seemed frozen in place, their eyes glistening with unshed tears. The veteran let out a shaky exhale. "I do not know how to live without her," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. JD reached across the table, placing a steady hand on the man's forearm. "Then do not," he said, "live with her." The veteran stared at him, something flickering in his expression, something fragile but powerful, something that had not been there before. And in that moment everything changed. The veteran sat still, his chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. "Live with her." The words lingered in the air, heavier than anything JD had said before. For so long, the veteran had felt like he was dragging grief behind him, a weight that never lifted, a burden that only grew heavier with time. But what if grief was not something to carry? What if it was something to walk with? His fingers slowly loosened around the coffee mug, and he let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. JD's voice was calm, steady. "You are still here, not because life is punishing you, but because it is asking something of you." The veteran's eyes lifted, hesitant but listening. "The men you lost in war, Margaret, all of them, they would not want you to spend the rest of your life waiting to disappear," JD said. "They would want you to keep going, to carry their stories, to carry her love." A single tear slipped down the veteran's cheek, and he wiped it away quickly, as if ashamed of the emotion. "I do not know how," he admitted. "I do not know what that even looks like." JD nodded slowly, understanding. "It does not have to be grand," he said. "It starts small, one step at a time. You find the things that bring you back to life." The veteran swallowed, his voice thin, vulnerable. "Like what?" JD thought for a moment, then asked, "Do you still listen to jazz?" The veteran blinked, surprised by the question. His lips pressed together, and then, after a long pause, he let out a small, almost shy chuckle. "Not since she left," he admitted. JD smiled faintly. "Then maybe you start there." The veteran looked down at his hands, as if holding something fragile and unseen. For so long, his grief had been a wall, something that kept him locked inside himself. But now it felt like a bridge. He looked up at JD again, something different in his expression. Not healed, not whole, but willing. "One step at a time," the veteran murmured. JD nodded. "That is all it takes." The cafe remained silent, reverent. Because everyone knew this was not just a conversation. This was the first step toward something new. The cafe was not the same anymore. It was not just a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of Columbus. It was not just a place where people came and went, where strangers sat in their own little worlds, sipping coffee and scrolling through their phones. It had become something else. A place where time had paused. A place where grief and healing had sat at the same table. A place where one man who thought he had nothing left had just been reminded that he did. JD Vance watched as the veteran exhaled slowly, as if he had been carrying something heavy for far too long, and was just now setting it down. For the first time since JD had walked in, the older man straightened his posture. His shoulders did not seem so weighed down. His hands did not grip the coffee mug so tightly. And when he spoke, his voice was not as broken as before. "I think Margaret would have liked you," the veteran said quietly. JD's lips tugged into a small smile. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." The veteran nodded. Then, after a long pause, he said something no one in the cafe expected. "Would you like to hear her favorite song?" JD nodded without hesitation. The veteran reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone with slightly unsteady hands, and tapped the screen a few times. A moment later, the soft melancholy notes of an old jazz song drifted through the air. The cafe went completely still. People at other tables set down their cups. Baristas behind the counter paused what they were doing. It was as if every single person in that room understood the weight of what was happening. This was not just a song. This was a memory being given new life. The veteran closed his eyes for a brief moment, listening. JD did not say anything. He just sat there, listening too. Because this was not a moment for words. This was a moment for remembering. And in that moment, Margaret was not gone. She was there. In the music, in the love that had not faded, in the man who, for the first time in a long time, did not feel alone. When the song ended, the veteran let out a slow breath. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. JD met his gaze. "Any time," he said. The veteran smiled, a real smile, small but genuine. And when JD Vance stood to leave, he knew he had not just changed one man's night. He had changed his tomorrow. The cafe remained silent as JD walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Because everyone knew they had just witnessed something they would never forget. If this story moved you, share it. Because sometimes all it takes is one conversation to remind someone that they are not alone.